It's 1959. The hood is up, chrome everywhere, sunlight bouncing off polished metal like diamonds scattered across steel. A small crowd gathers. Someone leans in close, and sitting deep in the engine bay is something that looks wrong. The valve covers are impossibly narrow. The engine looks tall, almost delicate. The proportions don't match anything else coming out of Detroit. It doesn't look like a Chevy. It doesn't look like a Ford. It doesn't even look like the engines Buick's sister divisions were building. But when the throttle snaps open, the whole car twists like it's been punched in the ribs. The rear end squats. Rubber screams. And that strange-looking engine announces itself to the entire block. Most people have no idea what they're looking at. They see the narrow valve covers and assume it's underpowered. They see the unusual layout and assume it's some kind of economy motor. They couldn't be more wrong, because this isn't a small engine pretending to be big. This is Buick's 401 cubic inch Nailhead V8, an engine so different, so stubbornly unorthodox, that it carved its own legend and sealed its own fate. You think you know why it disappeared? You think it's the same old story about emissions and changing times? Not like this. What almost nobody realizes is that the Nailhead didn't fail because it was weak. It didn't fail because it broke down. It didn't fail because customers complained. It failed because it was too different to survive the future GM was building. And once you understand how this engine worked, once you understand what made it special, you'll understand why it was doomed from the moment Detroit decided to standardize everything. To understand the Nailhead, you have to understand Buick. And Buick in the 1950s wasn't a rebel brand. It wasn't trying to be dangerous. It wasn't chasing teenagers with loud exhaust and racing stripes. It was a prestige division, a step above Chevrolet, a step below Cadillac. The brand for doctors, lawyers, and successful businessmen. The brand for people who had made it but didn't need to shout about it. Quiet power, smooth torque, effortless speed. That was the Buick philosophy. That was what customers expected when they signed the papers. Chevrolet chased youth. Pontiac chased excitement. Oldsmobile chased innovation. Cadillac chased luxury. Buick chased refinement. And that mindset shaped everything about the Nailhead. Every design decision, every engineering choice, every compromise made in those Flint, Michigan offices. By the early 1950s, Buick engineers weren't interested in high RPM screamers. They weren't building engines for drag strips. They weren't trying to impress magazine editors with horsepower numbers. They wanted torque, right now, immediate, effortless. The kind of power that moved heavy cars without drama. They wanted engines that pulled 2-ton sedans smoothly, silently, and forever. Engines that merged onto highways without downshifting. Engines that climbed mountains without raising their voice. Engines that lasted decades without major repairs. So instead of copying the wide, free-breathing valve layouts everyone else was using, Buick went in the opposite direction, completely, defiantly, almost stubbornly. They narrowed the valves, radically. The intake and exhaust valves stood nearly vertical, tiny in diameter compared to contemporary designs, packed tightly together in a way that looked almost fragile, like nails driven into the head. That's where the nickname came from. Nailhead. It wasn't marketing. It wasn't some clever advertising campaign dreamed up by Madison Avenue. It was mechanics laughing in disbelief the first time they pulled the valve covers. It was gearheads shaking their heads at how different it looked. It was confusion that eventually became affection. But there was a reason for everything. Buick engineers weren't crazy. They were calculating. With the valves so small and upright, Buick could run massive intake ports that shot straight into the cylinder. No sharp turns, no lazy bends, no airflow fighting against itself. The ports came down at a steep angle, almost like rifle barrels aimed at the pistons. At low RPM, the air charge hit hard, fast, dense, like a punch to the gut. That meant torque, lots of it, immediate throttle response, power that showed up the moment you asked for it, not later, not when the tachometer climbed, now. By the time the 401 Nailhead arrived in 1959, Buick had perfected the formula. They had been refining this design for years, learning its strengths, understanding its limitations, pushing it as far as they could. A 4.175-inch bore, a 3.64-inch stroke, exactly 401 cubic inches of cast iron muscle. The bore was big, the stroke was relatively short. This combination favored torque over high RPM horsepower. Exactly what Buick wanted. Compression ratios ranged from about 10-5.1 in standard form to over 11.1 in performance trims. These were aggressive numbers for the era, numbers that required premium fuel, numbers that squeezed every ounce of energy from each combustion event. And horsepower numbers? On paper, they didn't look crazy. 325 horsepower, sometimes 340. Nothing that would make headlines, nothing that would terrify the competition. But torque told the real story. Torque was where the Nailhead lived. 445 pound-feet of torque at barely 2,800 RPM. Think about that for a moment. Maximum torque arrived before most engines were even warmed up. Maximum torque arrived at cruising speeds. Maximum torque was always available, always waiting. That wasn't power you wound up. That wasn't power you had to work for. That was power that leaned on you. Floor it at 30 miles an hour and the car surged forward without drama. No screaming engine, no vibration through the steering wheel, no sense that the machinery was straining, just force, pure, relentless force. And that made the Nailhead feel unstoppable on the street. It made every Buick feel faster than its numbers suggested. It made competitors wonder what was hiding under those hoods. Merge onto the highway and the big sedan simply gathered speed. Pass a slower car and there was no hesitation. Climb a mountain road fully loaded and the engine never complained. This was the Buick experience. This was what customers paid for. This was refinement. But under the surface, hidden beneath that smooth power delivery, the same design that made it special was quietly painting it into a corner. The problem wasn't strength. God, no. The bottom end was nearly bulletproof. Massive main journals, thick webs connecting everything together, crankshafts that could survive abuse all day, connecting rods that didn't flex under pressure, bearings that lasted hundreds of thousands of miles. You could beat on a Nailhead, you could tow with it, you could neglect the oil changes. It kept running. The problem was breathing. Those tiny valves that gave the Nailhead its torque also strangled it at higher RPM. There was simply no way around physics. By about 4,800 to 5,000 RPM, airflow flatlined. The engine simply couldn't inhale any faster. The ports had done their job at low speeds, but at high speeds, they became restrictions. You could add more cam, longer duration, more lift, more overlap. It didn't matter. You could add more carburation, bigger carbs, multiple carbs, force feeding the engine. It didn't matter. You could add more compression, more squeeze, more theoretical efficiency. It didn't matter. The heads were the limit. The heads were always the limit. The heads would always be the limit. And unlike Chevy's small block, where better heads could unlock massive gains, the Nailhead's architecture didn't leave much room to grow. Want bigger valves? You hit the cylinder wall. There was nowhere to go. The chambers were too narrow. Want higher RPM? The valve train geometry fought you. The push rods were at odd angles. The rockers didn't like being rushed. The whole engine had been optimized for a specific purpose. And that purpose wasn't racing. Racers figured this out quickly. The ones who tried to make Nailheads compete learned hard lessons. On drag strips, Nailheads launched like freight trains. Nobody could touch them in the first 60 feet. The torque was devastating off the line. Tires hooked. Cars leaped forward. Crowds cheered. But by half track, something changed. Lighter, higher revving engines started pulling away. Chevys that looked slower at the start now inched ahead. Fords that seemed outmatched found their stride. The Nailhead ran out of steam. It gave everything it had at the bottom. There was nothing left at the top. One racer reportedly said, "It hits like a hammer, then runs out of breath like it smoked a pack of cigarettes." That quote spread through garages and speed shops. It became the accepted wisdom about nailheads: fast off the line, slow at the top, a compromise engine. And Buick knew this. They weren't blind. They weren't ignorant. Internally, engineers admitted the Nailhead wasn't a performance platform. It was a luxury torque motor. It was designed for a specific kind of buyer. A buyer who would never see redline. A buyer who valued smoothness over speed. That was fine, until the world changed, and the world was about to change dramatically. By the early 1960s, horsepower wars were heating up fast. The muscle car era was dawning. Young buyers wanted excitement. They wanted speed. They wanted engines that made noise and broke traction. Chevy was refining the small block into a modular monster, a simple design that could be bored, stroked, and modified endlessly. An engine that spawned an entire industry of aftermarket parts. An engine that would become the most popular V8 in history. Pontiac was dropping big cubes into lighter cars. They were creating the GTO. They were breaking GM's own rules. They were making headlines and selling dreams. Ford was experimenting with high-flow wedge heads and FE blocks. They were building engines for NASCAR. They were proving performance sold cars. They were preparing for total war. Chrysler was developing the Hemi, the ultimate statement of airflow over everything. The engine that would become a legend. The engine that terrified everyone. RPM mattered now. High RPM. Screaming redlines. Engines that wound up and made power all the way to the moon. Marketing mattered. Horsepower numbers on window stickers, magazine covers with smoking tires, drag strip victories that translated to showroom traffic. Numbers on paper mattered more than ever before, more than they ever should have. And this is where the Nailhead's uniqueness became a liability. Everything that made it special now worked against it. It was expensive to cast. Those narrow heads required precise machining. Tolerances were tight. Quality control was demanding. The angled intake ports complicated manufacturing. Special tooling was required. Assembly took longer. Costs added up. Meanwhile, Chevy's small block was cheap, light, and endlessly adaptable. You could build 1 million of them without thinking. You could modify them with parts from any speed shop in America. You could race them on Sunday and drive them to work on Monday. Worse still, GM was moving toward platform sharing. Corporate executives loved efficiency. They loved standardization. They loved the idea of shared parts across divisions. Corporate wanted engines that could be used across divisions. One design, multiple applications, lower costs, higher profits. Buick engines were becoming an island, isolated, unique, expensive, and the Nailhead was the most isolated of them all. It shared almost nothing with other GM V8s. Not the heads, not the intake layout, not the combustion chamber philosophy, not the valve angles, not the port design, not the manufacturing processes. From an accountant's point of view, it was a nightmare. Red ink everywhere. Inefficiency baked into every casting. Money being spent that could be saved. From an engineer's point of view, it was a dead end. No path forward, no evolution possible, no way to make it competitive without starting over. But Buick wasn't ready to let go yet. They had invested too much. They had customers who loved what the Nailhead delivered. They had a reputation built on torque and smoothness. In 1963, they stretched the design to its limit. One last evolution, one final expression, the 425 Nailhead. Same basic architecture, same tiny valves, same unusual port angles, same quirky layout, but now with a 4.31 25-inch bore and the same 3.64-inch stroke, 425 cubic inches. More displacement than ever before, more torque than ever before, 360 horsepower, 465 pound-feet of torque. It was the ultimate expression of the Nailhead philosophy, the final word on what this design could achieve, the culmination of a decade of refinement. And on the street, it was magnificent. Big Buicks could light the tires at highway speeds. Just floor it and watch the rear end break loose. Smoke pouring off the tires. The car sideways for a moment before hooking up. Terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Passing power was effortless. See an opportunity, press the pedal, change lanes. No downshifts, no drama, no waiting, just immediate response. Cruising was serene, the engine barely working at highway speeds, quiet as a whisper, smooth as silk, like floating on a cloud of torque. Buick loyalists loved every second of it. They didn't care about magazine tests. They didn't care about drag strip times. They cared about how the car made them feel. But the writing was on the wall, visible to anyone who wanted to see it. Because while Buick was perfecting torque, while they were squeezing the last drops from their unique design, the rest of the industry was chasing airflow. Bigger valves, better heads, more RPM, more horsepower, more of everything the Nailhead couldn't deliver. Behind closed doors, Buick engineers were already working on the replacement, something completely different, something that admitted defeat, something that followed the industry instead of leading it. A modern Wedgehead V8, lighter than the Nailhead, wider valve spacing, better breathing. Designed to rev, designed to make horsepower, designed to compete with everything else in the market. In 1967, it arrived. The Buick 400 and 430 engines, later evolving into the legendary 455. These engines breathed better, made more horsepower, revved higher without complaint, shared more design philosophy with other GM divisions, used more common parts, cost less to manufacture. They were good engines, solid engines, engines that would power some incredible cars, and just like that, the Nailhead was done. Production ended in 1966. The last ones rolled off the assembly line without ceremony. No farewell, no final performance edition, no commemorative plaques, no moment of silence. It didn't die in scandal or failure. It didn't die because of recalls or disasters. It was simply outgrown, left behind, replaced by something more practical. The factories retooled, the engineers moved on, the accountants smiled, and the Nailhead became history. But here's the twist most people miss, the part of the story that deserves to be told. The Nailhead didn't disappear because it was bad. It disappeared because it was honest. It was engineered for a world where torque mattered more than headlines, where smoothness mattered more than redline, where engines were judged by how they felt, not how they dynoed, where customers valued refinement over raw numbers. That world was passing, but it wasn't wrong. It was just different. In trucks, boats, and hot rods, the Nailhead lived on. People who needed torque found it. People who valued reliability discovered it. People who didn't care about magazine tests appreciated it. Drag racers learned to work around its limits. They used the torque advantage off the line. They built combinations that maximized the engine's strengths. They stopped trying to make it something it wasn't. Aftermarket aluminum heads appeared decades later, finally fixing the airflow problem Buick never intended to solve. Modern Nailheads with better heads can rev. They can make horsepower. They can compete. But purists argue that misses the point. The Nailhead was never supposed to rev, it was supposed to torque. And it did that better than almost anything. And today, a well-built 401 or 425 Nailhead is prized, sought after by collectors, cherished by enthusiasts, not because it's the fastest, not because it dominates at the track, but because it's different, because it tells a story, because it represents a road not taken. Pop the hood at a car show and people stop. They gather around, they stare, they ask questions. Those valve covers don't look like anything else. That intake layout tells a story. Those narrow heads speak of a different philosophy. A story about an era when engineers weren't copying each other yet, when different ideas could coexist, when bold designs could survive, at least for a while. When refinement was valued as highly as raw power, the Nailhead wasn't killed by emissions, It wasn't killed by reliability problems. It wasn't killed by racing losses. It wasn't killed by customer complaints. It wasn't killed by engineering failures. It was killed by sameness, by corporate efficiency, by shared platforms, by accountants with spreadsheets, by a future that no longer had room for engines that went their own way. And that's the real reason Buick's 401 Nailhead was too different to survive. It didn't lose the war. The war changed. The rules changed, the priorities changed, and the Nailhead couldn't change with them. Somewhere out there, a few of them still run, in old Buicks lovingly preserved, in hot rods built by people who understand, in garages where the past isn't forgotten, still making torque, still smooth, still different. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Detroit's strangest legends, let me know in the comments what engine you want to hear about next. Another forgotten V8, a rivalry that shaped the industry, a design that broke all the rules? And make sure to subscribe because there are still plenty of untold stories hiding under old hoods.